Hi, welcome to the third video in the housing module. This video will focus on justice involvement and how interactions with the criminal justice system can impact your client's housing. In this video, we'll start by taking a look at what you can do to help a client who's been charged with an offense and/or taken into custody. We'll then focus on how charges and incarceration can impact social housing in particular. After that, we'll move on to looking at issues of discrimination as it relates to justice involvement and seeking housing. And then we'll wrap up by taking a look at some of the key things to watch out for when it comes to housing. Let's first take a look at how you can help a client who's been charged with a criminal offense. As we saw in the last video, illegal acts committed in the rental unit or on the residential property can create a high risk of eviction for your client, even if they weren't involved in the act and even if it involved one of their guests. They can also be at a high risk of eviction even if they aren't arrested, even if they aren't charged, or even if the charges are later withdrawn. If your client tells you that they were charged or that they've had a recent interaction with the police, you should ask them if this occurred at home. If it did, they could be at a high risk of eviction, and you should warn your client to keep an eye on their mail and seek legal advice immediately if they receive a notice from their landlord. Even if the charges or police interactions are as a result of racial profiling and maybe without merit, your client can still be at a high risk of eviction. If this happens, you should refer your client for legal advice from one of Ontario's specialty legal clinics that deals with race-based discrimination matters. Some examples of these clinics include Aboriginal Legal Services, the Black Legal Action Centre, and the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. If you have a client who's taken into custody, whether because of something that happened at their rental unit or not, they might still be at risk of eviction. This is because periods of incarceration, even if they're short, can affect someone's ability to pay rent. If your client is receiving housing support from a program like Ontario Works or ODSP, they might be at risk of losing those benefits because of time spent in custody. This could place them at a higher risk of eviction for not paying their rent. If your client is taken into custody, you can help by making arrangements to check their mail for any eviction paperwork. And if they receive any, you can refer them for legal advice to see if there are any steps that they can take to avoid an eviction. If you know your client receives income support from a program like Ontario Works or ODSP, help them contact their worker to request that their housing support payments continue while they're in custody so that they can maintain their housing. The risk to your client's housing might be even greater if they live in social or subsidized housing. This is housing where part of the rent is paid by the government or a nonprofit organization. It can also be referred to sometimes as rent geared to income housing. One of the ways that your client can be at a greater risk is if they're evicted for an illegal act on the social housing property. When this happens, some social housing providers will not only evict tenants for the illegal act, but then they'll also bar them from social housing for several years. This can create additional barriers for your client when they go to seek housing later on. If your client lives in social housing and is incarcerated, they could also be at risk of eviction or at risk of losing the rent geared to income subsidy because of the time they spend away from the unit. This is because some social housing providers forbid extended absences. If your client is absent from their social housing unit due to incarceration, this could put them at risk of eviction, and you should warn them about this risk. But sometimes it's hard to know the rules for each local social housing provider and whether it'll affect your client, so it's best to refer them for legal advice to discuss the rules in place for their specific provider. Justice involvement can also limit your client's ability to apply for and get access to social housing and rent geared to income subsidy waitlists in some cases. For example, if your client has previously been evicted for an illegal act on the property, a social housing provider might be able to disqualify them or their household from accessing a social housing unit. If this happens to your client, you can help them source alternative housing options in the area, but you should always refer them for legal advice too, to see if there are any legal options available to them. But justice involvement can also impact your client's chances of securing housing in other ways, including landlords discriminating against them due to their criminal record. Landlords can and do request criminal record checks sometimes from prospective tenants or ask about someone's criminal history before renting to them. Landlords aren't prohibited from doing this, and it can lead to your client facing discrimination due to their justice involvement. Unfortunately, this might happen to your client, but you can warn them about it and help them source alternative options. Now that we've covered how charges, incarceration, and discrimination can impact your client's housing, let's take a look at some other things that you can watch out for and help your client with. The first thing to watch out for is that a period of incarceration can lead to your client falling behind on rent or other payments. If your client isn't able to work or is unable to receive Ontario Works or ODSP payments while they're in custody, make sure you remind them to call their caseworker to see if there are any additional amounts they might be eligible for. Or help them find other sources of funding, such as from a rent bank or Ontario Works emergency assistance. The second thing to watch out for is that bail conditions or other court orders can impact who your client lives with or where they can live, and your client may not be able to return to their previous address once they're released from custody. If this is the case, your client might need to find alternative accommodations, and you can help them with that. But this could also lead to custody and access issues if your client has children. If your client has custody or access arrangements already in place, you should refer them for legal advice. Another thing you can look out for is a client who's living in social housing but who's taken into custody. If your client will be absent from their unit for an extended period of time, it's important that they get legal advice to try to avoid any evictions due to their absence. The last thing to watch out for is domestic abuse. If domestic abuse has occurred, there are different housing-related issues to keep in mind. If your client is a victim of domestic violence and they believe they are at risk of harm or injury, they can break their lease early. If your client would like to do this, you should refer them for legal advice immediately, because there's complicated paperwork involved and strict deadlines that need to be met. On the other hand, if your client has been charged or accused of domestic violence, they might be at risk of losing their tenancy, and they should be referred for legal advice immediately. And just like that, we've covered housing and justice involvement. Until next time.